Hey guys, how's everyone doing? This is Sir Jedi Sentinel, and welcome to Another Timeline, Another Life, our retrospective review series of David Warner's time as the Unbound Doctor. Today, we will be looking at his debut appearance, Doctor Who Unbound, Sympathy for the Devil, released in June of 2003, written by Jonathan Clements and directed by Gary Russell. As always, because I do these unscripted, there is a blanket spoiler warning in place, just in case I do decide to talk about spoilers. If you do not wish to be spoiled for today's story, in the description box below is the link to Big Finish's website, where you can purchase Doctor Who Unbound Sympathy for the Devil. The CD is now sadly out of print, so it is only available for digital download, or you can buy it as part of a digital bundle that collects the original 8 Unbound stories. As I said in the introductory video, if you hadn't watched that, Doctor Who Unbound was a series celebrating Doctor Who's 40th anniversary in 2003 by doing what-if stories. Each story had a different premise. Sympathy for the Devil's premise is, what if the Doctor had not been UNIT's scientific advisor? This was the conceit of Jon Pertwee's era as the Third Doctor, Crash Course. At the end of the Second Doctor's era, the Time Lords had captured the Doctor and decided to punish him for his various crimes, as they perceived, such as stealing the TARDIS and interfering in several events throughout the timelines. They did this by stealing his knowledge of time travel, disabling his TARDIS, forcing a regeneration upon him, thus turning him into the Third Doctor, and exiling him to Earth. He was exiled to Earth during the 70s, or possibly the 80s. Do not go down the rabbit hole that is the UNIT dating controversy, where he served as the scientific advisor to UNIT. So the premise for Sympathy for the Devil is that after his sentence is passed, this time the Doctor is exiled to Hong Kong in the 90s. And one of the things that sticks out immediately to me is the basis for this particular Doctor's banishment, exile I mean, seems a little different. So like I said, in the Pertwee era, the Time Lords disabled the Doctor's TARDIS entirely. Not only that, they took the knowledge of the TARDIS's workings, in particular its ability to travel in time, from his mind so that he couldn't come up with a workaround and get his TARDIS working again. And then, of course, over the course of the Third Doctor era, as he started doing missions for the Time Lords as early as Pertwee's second season, they slowly restored the Third Doctor's abilities to him until he could start traveling again. By comparison, this Doctor's exile seems very different. For one thing, let's get this out of the way, instead of landing in the UK in the 70s, the Doctor lands in Hong Kong in the 90s. To be specific, 1997. In fact, the day before the UK handover of Hong Kong to the Chinese government. I did look this up really quick. I didn't go into the full details of the history or anything about it. So, like, if you want a deeper lecture on what this actually was and how this came to happen, you're not going to get that here. But for some reason or another, this story says it was essentially a side effect of an after effect of the Opium Wars. Hong Kong was a British colony. And in 1997, it was finally surrendered back to the Chinese government. That's all I know about it. That's all you're getting. I did look it up. It was a real thing, so that's all I know. Anyway, as I was saying, instead of the UK in the 70s, the Doctor arrives in Hong Kong in the 90s, but he doesn't seem to have the same parameters of his exile that Jon Pertwee had. For example, the TARDIS was completely grounded. He couldn't do anything. As this Doctor remarks in this story, he can travel in space, but he can't travel in time. Also, it seems that this Doctor does not have the workings of time travel and the TARDIS taken from his memories, again, like Jon Pertwee had, because, by the end of the story, he is able to figure out a workaround that gets the TARDIS working again. Just some interesting compare and contrast to what happened there, because that's a lot of what this story does, both to its benefit and to its detriment. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. Like, the big thing, though, that really sets this story out for its premise is that the Jon Pertwee era in this timeline, in this universe, still happened. It happened without the Doctor's involvement. So events and stories from the Jon Pertwee era had very different outcomes to what they had on TV. And that is one of the disappointing aspects of this story, because, well, it's a double-edged sword. I really like the world building of this story, because the Doctor slowly learns the state of the world in his perceived absence. But so much of it is conveyed through exposition. And I think part of the problem is that this story is set in Hong Kong, which will also lead into another problem that we'll talk about down the line. And boy, that is a big one. But it's just because by setting it in Hong Kong, we get a lot of tell, don't show, instead of show, don't tell, or whatever the audio equivalent of show, don't tell would be. The Doctor is not witnessing what happened to London. He is constantly being told about it. Like, some of the big stories we get referenced are Spearhead from Space, or possibly Terror of the Autons. It's never specifically says which Auton story they're specifically referring. Wait. At one point, the Brigadier mentions Plastic Flowers. So yes, it was Terror of the Autons. We also get references to Doctor Who and the Silurians and Invasion of the Dinosaurs, which seem to happen at the same time. They seem to have been, in this timeline, seem to have been fused in the same story. So instead of scientists who wanted to alter the course of evolution and discovered crude time travel, it's the Silurians trying to do Invasion of the Dinosaurs. So Mike Yates tried to time travel with a bunch of nukes to stop their plan and died in the process, and now there is a crater and lake in the center of London. The other big Pertwee story that gets mentioned, and I say big because it is a major plot point as opposed to just a reference, is the Mind of Evil. And we will talk about that a little bit more later, hopefully, if I remember. But yeah, because it's interesting too, because I found this on TARDIS Wiki. I know TARDIS Wiki, take it with a grain of salt, but apparently, according to either Gary Russell or Jonathan Clements, their idea was that if the Pertwee era happened without Jon Pertwee, the turning point for the entire course of history would be the Mind of Evil. Not that I entirely mind. Like, the Mind of Evil is my second favorite Pertwee story after Frontier in Space. Anyway, let's go into performances. So we have two leads. I don't remember in my introduction if I listed them, because, I usually try to do that. We have David Warner as the Doctor, and Nicholas Courtney as the Brigadier, Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart, retired. And it's interesting, while everyone is giving these, I don't want to say exaggerated or bombastic, that feels like the wrong word. Everyone is giving these very outstated performances, these big emotional performances. By comparison, Warner and Courtney are very understated. It gives an interesting contrast to the rest of the cast in this story, and it really makes them stand out. I don't know how I entirely feel about David Warner in this particular story. It is a good performance, I'm not arguing that, and it speaks to Warner's charisma as an actor that he's pulling it off. It's just, the writing feels like this particular version of the Doctor isn't entirely fleshed out. Like, he's doing very generic Doctorisms at most, although sometimes it specifically feels like this Doctor is still written to be Jon Pertwee, because in this timeline, in this universe, this is still the third Doctor, and it's just Warner's strength and charisma as an actor that is allowing it to really make his role the own, but it's working against the material, not with it. Similar, conversely, this version of the Brigadier feels fully fleshed out, and this is one of the few instances where the world building really shines. Because, like I said, disappointingly, a lot of it is conveyed through exposition. The Brigadier is one of the few instances where it's actually depicted. Because, again, in this timeline without the Doctor, Unit became a laughingstock. At worst, it was not able to stop any of the events of the Pertwee era from happening. At best, it was, but then sort of in follow-up investigations and, like doing the paperwork in the bureaucracy that followed, let's sum it up like that, the Brigadier had no proof these events happened. So he was eventually discharged, and kind of, he never says it himself, but the story makes it clear what happened. He fled the country in disgrace, because Unit was essentially so botched, so screwed up, it was deemed, people saw it as kind of a quack organization. The Brigadier at one point mentions all the undesirables that none of the other branches of the military could get rid of, presumably for reasons of knowing high people in high places, were sent to Unit. And that is one of Courtney's performance is really good here, because he shows that, because the Brigadier is a career soldier and he really loves what he does. It shows how bitter he is. It is really subtle. Again, compared to everyone else, the subtlety really stands out, but it is so well executed. I just now realizing I forgot to kind of give my general thoughts overall, especially compared to the rest of Unbound, but we'll talk about that a little more at the end. I did talk about Warner. He's really good. He and the Brigadier have a really good scene where they reunite again, because again, this is an alternate universe version of the third Doctor. So for the Brigadier, he has met the second Doctor in the Web of Fear and the Invasion. And they have this really nice scene in the pub the Brigadier owns where they're just kind of shooting the breeze, catching each other up on what's happened. The Doctor's exile versus everything that happened with the Brigadier. That culminates in this really great moment where the Brigadier just goes, "Where were you when I needed you?" The Brigadier is very much your stereotypical British stiff upper lip type, but you can kind of tell he is barely keeping it together because, essentially the Doctor, in a way, is his validation. We have a couple of other standout performances to talk about as well. This has a decently sized cast, but I would say there's only maybe 4 or possibly 5 leads. We'll talk about the 5th one, because if you're familiar with this story, you probably know what that is. And if you don't, it's not the one you're thinking about. So first, we'll talk about the Brigadier's replacement. The current head of Unit, Colonel Brimacum Wood, played by a young actor, you may have heard of him, a wee Scottish lad named David Tennant. David Tennant did a lot of Big Finish, playing various roles before he was cast as the 10th Doctor. So he was Colonel Brimacum Wood here in Sympathy for the Devil. He reprised his role as main universe, quote-unquote, in canon Colonel Brimacum Wood in the original Unit miniseries. I do not recommend the original Unit miniseries. There is only one good story in it. Maybe I should cover that at some point. Anyway. He had a part as a Nazi officer in the Sylvester McCoy audio drama Colditz. He was in the Colin Baker audio drama Medicinal Purposes. He was one of the Time Lords overseeing the second Doctor's trial at the end of the War Games in the other Unbound audio, Exile. And I can't remember. I'm sure he's done a few other roles, but those are the ones that are coming to me right now. Wood is essentially meant to be the antithesis of everything the Brigadier is. Like I said, the Brigadier is that sort of stereotypical stiff upper lip British type person. he is very calculating. He likes to hear all the options before he acts. Wood is very brash. He is very emotionally motivated, the prime emotion being anger, irritation, and impatience. And he tends to fly off the handle, whereas even when he's aggravated, the Brigadier tries to stay collected. It's a great little piece, and there's a scene where it comes into play, like the Brigadier and Wood compare each other to the Doctor and the Masters. Oh, spoilers, the Master is in this story. We're getting to him, don't worry. As the Brigadier, as in one of their scenes together, Wood kind of describes it as, "You don't like me. You don't like that I'm a soldier, do you, Brigadier?" And the Brigadier responds, "I know. No, you are a soldier. You're just not a gentleman." Or something to that effect. I wish I remembered the dialogue. The dialogue in this story is kind of another standout. Just the way characters interact. So many of the best scenes are just these two-handers between various characters. Like, I mentioned the scene between the Brigadier and the Doctor catching up. There's a scene with the Brigadier and Wood getting into an argument while the Doctor's trying to interject with what he's learned. And again, there is a late scene later down the line with the Doctor and the Master, because the Master similarly has lived through the Jon Pertwee era in the Doctor's absence. And like I said, the dialogue, the exchanges between characters are really what makes this story work. So let's talk about the Master. The Master is initially posing as a man only called Kala, who seems to be defecting. In fact, when we initially find him, he is found in the ruins of a plane crash, and which leads to his regeneration from Roger Delgado into Mark Gatiss. Before I get into Gatiss 2, fun fact, this was the first audio depiction of a regeneration. It's fine, I have nothing to really comment on. The sound design works well enough for what it's conveying. Not entirely, now that I think about it, because it wasn't until re-listens when I figured out what was happening in that scene. Because, again, it is implied that prior to Mark Gatiss, it was still Roger Delgado. Anyway, the Master, Mark Gatiss, he's fine. I was surprised when I looked at the credits to double check that they kept the Sam Kisgart. They started the Sam Kisgart joke as early as this story. I don't remember if I talked about it in Masterful or when I did my Master ranking, but, as sort of a fun homage to some of the ways Classic Who, especially Classic Who under John Nathan Turner, tried to hide the Master's reveal. Like, they'd often do it in the credits with anagrams. They'd either give Anthony Ainley an anagram, or they would make a character's name an anagram for Master, while also making Anthony Ainley's name an anagram. They do the same thing here. They don't credit him as the Master, they credit him as Kala, but they make an anagram of Mark Gatiss' name, Sam Kisgart. In and of itself, that would have been fine, but they kept doing it, and by the time we get to the New Adventures of Bernice Summerfield, when they start doing behind-the-scenes content, they tried to flesh Sam Kisgart out as a real person. And it's just a running joke I have never found funny. But yeah, Mark Gatiss as the Master, he's fine. I think he kind of has the same problem that James Dreyfus does, minus the transphobia, in that he's kind of a little bit generic, and he's a little bit too much written like Roger Delgado, with not enough of his own unique flavor sprinkled in. Although, that being said, of all of his appearances, going from memory, because who knows, maybe re-listening will change my opinion, this is easily Gatiss' best performance as this version of the Master. Like I mentioned, alluded to earlier, the scene with him and the Doctor, where they just have this huge argument about everything the Master has been through in the Doctor's absence. It is another particular highlight of this story. And just like, he really gets to show off his more sinister side, which I think is an aspect that a lot of the later stories with the Gatiss Master don't really get, just given the context of the Gaius Master in those stories. He's only made a handful of appearances. He's appeared here in Sympathy for the Devil, The New Adventures of Bernice Summerfield, Volume 3, Volume 4. He appeared in the War Master Series 4, which, much like David Warner's Doctor with Bernice Summerfield, saw him coming into the main universe. And then he appeared in Masterful. Like I said, of all of Gatiss' performances, this is the best one. It's also his most sinister. So with all that out of the way, I should say too, this I was gonna save this for the wrap up, kind of realizing I skipped it in the introduction, but it's kind of a good place to talk about here. Sympathy for the Devil is regarded as one of the better stories in the Unbound range, specifically referring to those original 8 Unbound stories. It's often ranked closer to the top as one of the best. I think for me personally, it might be in my top 5. I haven't heard some of those Unbound stories in a while, so I don't know what exactly my ranking is for the most part. Like, I know my top 3. Full Fathom 5 is my favorite. Number 2 is Deadline, my favorite Rob Shearman story, and I think one of Rob Shearman's best stories. And then number 3 is Ald Mortality, my favorite Mark Platt story. I know Sympathy for the Devil is in my top 5. I think it's number 4. But we do have to address the one big black mark against this story. So, like I said, the Master was in a plane crash, and when Colonel Brimacum Wood comes across and Unit come across the remains of the plane, they set up a temporary base of operations at the closest possible location, which happens to be a Buddhist monastery. And we meet the abbot, who is played by a white man. And we have a case of yellowface going on here. I'm sure not in the recording studio, but I don't know what happened here. I don't know if it's because Big Finish was a much smaller company back then. They probably didn't have the resources they have now and couldn't reach into the actor pools they could reach into now. Because like nowadays, even so, if you listen to a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, a lot of how they get actors for something, like sure, they'll do casting calls and stuff and reach out, but a lot of it is, oh, hey, I knew this actor, so I reached out to see if they want to take the role. And like I said, back in 2003, I don't know what happened here. Like I said, I think it's just they had a smaller pool of actors to reach out with, but this is so yikes. Like I said, it's essentially yellowface what's going on here, because Trevor Littledale, who plays the abbot, is a white man. And it's made worse by the fact that a lot of the abbot's dialogue is that pseudo-philosophical Chinese speak, with a lot of metaphors like, oh, the reed has to bend in the wind, and, stuff like that. And most glaringly, while credit where it is due, it's not as outrageous or egregious or horrible as it is in other instances. Littledale is doing the voice. And if you have ever seen Yellowface, like, just off the top of my head, I can think of 2 examples. Li Sen Chang in the 4th Doctor story, The Talons of Wang Chiang, or Peter Sellers in the movie Murder by Death. You know exactly what the voice is. I'm not gonna do it, but you know what it is. It's just, like I said, it is the one thing holding this story back from being truly great. I think if it weren't for that, this would have been such a better story. And it just reinforces the point I made earlier. Why is this set in Hong Kong? Why couldn't this be set in the London that the exposition was all setting up? It really seems like there is no point to it. Anyway, the story ends with the Doctor using the Master's own scheme against him and, finding a workaround to get the TARDIS working again. And he goes off into the universe with the Brigadier as his companion. Sympathy for the Devil is a mostly good story. It's got very solid performances with some really great understated, subtle performances from David Warner and Nicholas Courtney. It's just got the one big black mark in the form of the yellow face portrayal of the abbot. But beyond that, the world building is interesting, if not executed well, and the dialogue is really what helps it. But those are just my thoughts. Have you heard Sympathy for the Devil? What are yours? Start a conversation in the comments below. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell next to subscribe to get notifications when I upload, and in the description box below, you'll find the link to my socials where you can follow me and get updates on the channel. And this is Sir Jedi Sentinel, and I'll see you guys next time when the Doctor and the Brigadier will be traveling across the galaxy and meet an old foe in Masters of War.